Okay, for those of you who have not seen this before, I just want to walk you through quickly how to get to what you will be seeing tonight. If you go to Mormon Battalion Association website, this is the home page, the splash page. If you go to Trail and select there, it'll take you to this page, and you have interactive maps here at the top. You have a static map. That is not the map that you want. That's just for publishing and for people who want it. But if you click on Follow the Trail, you will come to this screen. This screen is designed to represent the Mormon Battalion Trail and story throughout its extent. This is the work that I've been working on and still continue to try to clean it up and make it a little bit better. Now, this is what you'll see when you get to the Mormon Battalion Trails. I'm going to close this one off because for my presentation tonight, I don't want to have everything on there that will distract. So I'm going to close that one off and move to this one. For the enlistment and the recruitment, the story really concentrates between Washington and the Western area. And I'm just going to mention very briefly here 5 of my major sources. For the Iowa Mormon Trail section, it's going to be the Mormon Trail Revisited by Greg Francois out of the Patrice Press. That's an excellent source. Of course, we have Sherman Fleet's History May Be Searched in Vain, Military History of the Mormon Battalion, 1846-1847. Wonderful text. But in more detail, this is a rather rare one to find. It's the Winning the West. It's the letter book of General Kearney leading up to, with a lot of background information as well. It's a great investment if you have that much of a military interest. Lastly, of course, published is Kingdom of the West, the Army of Israel by Bagley and Bigler. Excellent text, a little bit thick, a little bit dense and academic, but it's an excellent text that I highly recommend. Of course, as is usual, though, the major resource that I use is the journals. And besides the military journals by Emory and Cook and the others, I've also added the journals by Wilford Woodruff and Clayton, which in the church collection. Also on our website, we have the Mormon Battalion Journal collection. You can use that to get to things. So with that background, let me now just mention briefly, I will not speak much to the Washington negotiations and the things that took place there between President Polk, Jesse Little, Thomas Kane, Amos Kendall, which probably most of you aren't aware of, but a major player in getting the battalion raised. I do want to specifically mention this paragraph. This is Polk, President Polk, and his journal is also available to us. The Mormons, if taken into the service, will constitute more than a quarter of Colonel Kearney's command, and the main object of taking the Mormons into service will be to conciliate them and prevent them from assuming a hostile attitudes towards the U.S. after their arrival in California. And it was with this view to prevent this singular sect from becoming hostile to the U.S. that I held a conference with Mr. Little. With the same view, I am to see him again tomorrow. That was the purpose of the executive to recruit the Mormon Battalion. And here are the Polk, that's the link to the Polk diaries. And I can highly recommend that you read through that section. And the links are here in the text that I have. So now, ignoring the Washington negotiations, I want to come back here, primarily this triangular area. I can't talk tonight. And speak to this area as part, this is really the recruitment playground, if you will. The major things, once the orders were cut in Washington and sent on to Colonel Kearney, this is where everything takes place. So the Saints have begun leaving Nauvoo in February, as you well know, and as they're slogging their way across the Iowa Mormon Trail, other things are happening. Down at Fort Leavenworth, of course, the year before in 1845, Colonel Kearney and a group of the dragoons had been sent all the way out to South Pass. This was a test, if you will, to see if in fact the dragoons could get that far in a reasonable amount of time. That expedition was a great success, hard on the dragoons, but it proved that the U.S. could project its force along the Oregon-California Trail at its will. That set the stage for President Polk pursuing the Mexican War the following year after the provocation down in Texas. As part of this, you may be aware that just a little bit north in what is today Des Moines, Iowa, was a small fort called Fort Des Moines. And the commanding officer of that was James Allen Jr., our captain that runs the Mormon Battalion. That fort is being abandoned because all the Indians are being moved across the Missouri River to the west side of the Missouri River and out into the Indian Territory. So with the abandonment of the Indians and moving them to the west, all of those troops are freed up. But in the meanwhile, what's important here is that this route is probably the route that Allen follows to find the Mormon Battalion. Allen finds the Mormons. This is along a dragoon trail that follows along the Grand River, both the West Fork and the East Fork, and Mount Pisgah is right off the side of the East Fork, if you've ever been there. And this dragoon trail falls within just a few miles of that. So as the Saints arrive in the area of Garden Grove and Mount Pisgah and they start their work, they're sending wagons down into upper Missouri to try to get food, try to find work. And so even though we tend to think of this as wilderness area, and it was largely wilderness area, there were established trails, and this dragoon trail being a most important one, coming all the way up to Des Moines, Fort Des Moines. The second thing that's happening that spring is with the closing of that fort, the Army says, well, we need, and the government says we need another fort in this particular area. And so they established a small fort beginning in March of 1846 at a location they called Table Creek. Table Creek is close to today's Nebraska City, and it's about 1 day's horse ride south of Council Bluffs, maybe a day and a half. If you're in a hurry, you can make it in a day. So Kearney and a whole bunch of troops are sent up from Fort Leavenworth by ship, by steamship. In fact, we know the name of that. It's the Amherst. And they are sent all the way up to Table Creek. Someone's moving my screen. Who's moving my screen? Anyway, they're sent all the way up to Table Creek to begin establishing this small fort. While they are there, things start percolating for the Mexican War. And Kearney is recalled back down to Fort Leavenworth. He leaves a number of the troops up there, including Major Thomas Swords, who is a quartermaster, and who later becomes the quartermaster for the entire Army of the West. And he also leaves up there Lieutenant Andrew Jackson Smith and a number of others. These two guys are going to play a major role in the discussion a little bit later. But they're at Table Creek. And as part of the process of setting up a new fort, one of the things the regulations call for is the establishment of what's called a council of administration. This is a group of officers and sometimes non-commissioned officers who are pulled in to form a small committee to administer the post. They have responsibility for some of the funds. They have responsibility for setting rules and regulations, including for like the laundresses and the sutler. The sutler being, of course, the modern equivalent of the post exchange or the commissary, if you will. The sutler is the person who brings in supplies and equipment and materials for the troops that the Army does not provide. And the troops can buy from them, from the sutler, and it goes against their wages. The Council of Administration decides who the sutler will be. And Andrew Jackson Smith actually sits on this Council of Administration for Table Creek. And one of the things that is proposed is a new firm, and I don't know the name of this firm yet. We hope to find that in the National Archives at some point. But the firm is administered and owned by Quartermaster Thomas Swords, and let me say this the right way. The way I wrote it earlier, if I have it. Quartermaster Swords partnered up with a Weston, Missouri landowner. He was a speculator, an investor, and a part-time physician, and his name was George B. Sanderson. So this is the proof that we finally wanted to have, that George B. Sanderson, Dr. Sanderson, was in fact active in the Council Bluffs area even before he's selected as the physician for the Mormon Battalion. And he's right there at Table Creek, only a day and a half ride away from Council Bluffs. So information is passing back and forth along the Dragoon Trail that the Mormons are coming across. And Lieutenant, I'm going to get to this in just a minute. I apologize, that's not the click I wanted. But anyway, so here at Mount Pisgah, we have everybody loaded up and working along. And on June 18th, if I remember correctly, June 17th, the orders arrive back at Fort Leavenworth, detailing Colonel Kearney to raise a group, a battalion from among the Mormons if he can. Now, sometimes you hear that the Mormons are given the opportunity to raise troops when thousands of troops had been turned away. And you think sometimes that perhaps that's an exaggeration that Allen is making, but in fact, when you read the letter book by Kearney, you see a number of letters that he's sending back to different areas of Missouri where troops are being volunteering, but in fact, they're really not needed. In fact, two communities, Weston, Missouri, just across from Fort Leavenworth, and St. Joseph up the river a few miles, both had enough people volunteer to form companies to join with the Missouri troops to go west. And Kearney writes to him and says, no, we don't need you. So you can imagine their chagrin a few weeks later, within 8 weeks, the Mormon Battalion comes marching through, and they're wondering, well, why didn't we get chosen to go? Why the Mormons? So yes, this recruiting is going on. It's nationwide, quite frankly. Thousands and thousands are being turned away. Allen gets his orders on the 18th. Excuse me, on the 20th. He gets his orders from Colonel Kearney to go recruit among the Mormons. Well, if you remember, then he gets underway on the 20th, and the distance here is something on the order of close to 150 miles. And so that's going to take him 3.5, 4.5, 5 days to make that distance, even doing 30 miles a day. So this ridge line route up that takes them on over to Fort Des Moines is more than likely the way they went, in my opinion. Allen arrives at Mount Pisgah on the 26th, the evening of the 26th. And he has with him a number of dragoons and an escort. Now, depending upon the person writing about how many troops were with him, you get slightly different numbers. But with the help of Tim Kimball, we were able to go back into the Army records, and we now know the name of the troops that were with him. So we've got Captain James Allen Jr., he's the colonel of Company I of the 1st Dragoons. The privates that were with him were Patrick McDonald, Alpheus Pomeroy, John Staley Jr., Henry Stuckenberg, and also we really believe that Captain Allen had with him his slave Levi, or John Wells, or perhaps Wills. So that makes up the contingent of people that were with Captain Allen on the recruiting process and his trip. And of course, he had his wagon with him, and we'll see that in a minute. Now, the question is sometimes, well, where exactly at Council Grove did this happen? If we take the current photograph in the background of the area, the Pisgah Grove was the grove of the large oak trees, and they had a triangle here of where the different trails came together. And I'm pretty sure, my opinion is, this is the area in which the recruiting took place. And Allen would have met with the men there, and later Brigham Young would have done the recruiting there. So, of course, you know that Allen met with zero success there at Mount Pisgah and was told to go on over to Council Bluffs to meet with Brigham Young at that location. So on the 27th in the morning, Allen meets with the saints there at the Grove and heads west, but he's preceded by one of the representatives to take a warning to Brigham Young and the leaders of the church that in fact the army is coming to try to recruit among them. Now I have to go back now to Council Bluffs, because Brigham Young and the crew have left there in mid-June, and early June, and they make the rest of the way over to Council Bluffs. So we're going to zoom in here now on Council Bluffs a little bit, and we're going to see a few more things in this area. I apologize, don't have as fine a control on this as I would like to. The trail comes in, and at this location, Redemption Hill is a flat-topped hill where Brigham Young and some of the leaders first camped. They left it the next day. They moved down into the flats, had too many mosquitoes, and so they moved back to Redemption Hill. And that becomes what's also known as not just Redemption Hill, but also Taylor Pratt Hill, sometimes referred to even as Mosquito Creek Hill. So that becomes the de facto headquarters for the church. Here's where things really get interesting, that we had not appreciated this before. On the morning of June 28th, this is a Sunday, if I remember correct, the morning of June 28th, Brother Christman comes up from Traders Point, Sarpies, and says there's a couple of Army officers down there at Traders Point saying that if we don't enlist, that the Army is going to come and ask for troops, and if we don't enlist, we'll be considered enemies of the nation. And this is recorded in Clayton's, oh shoot, not Clayton, Wilford Woodruff's record, as I recall. Yeah, Willard Richards is the one who records this. Well, just a few hours later, in comes the express courier from Mount Pisgah, and he's got word that Captain Allen's back there at Mount Pisgah, and he's on his way to recruit. So we have two things going on. We have people coming up from Table Creek saying the Army wants to enlist you, and if you don't, you're going to be enemies of the nation. And we've got intelligence that the army's coming from the east along the trail, and they have the same message. We want to recruit you, and we need 500 of your men to go to Mexico. The one thing I've left out also down at Table Creek, there had been a situation where one of the wagon groups called Emmett's Camp or Emmett's Group of the Saints had left the immediate area of the Brigham Young group. They had been out there for some time. They were encamped very close to Table Creek, and apparently they had been causing some problems. And the story is that Indian Agent Mitchell had sent a letter asking for the army to come and take care of these Mormons and get them out of the way. We've not found that letter, to my knowledge, and if we do, that will be an important thing to find. But so here you have the story that Emmett's group is causing problems. The Indian agents sent a letter, and that's also communicated to Brigham Young by Peter Sarpy. And the leadership of the church are concerned about that, so they actually sent a delegation to Indian Agent Mitchell there at Traders Point and say, what's up about this? Why would you do that? And Mitchell says, no, I never sent any such letter. So you've got Sarpy saying one thing, you've got Mitchell saying something else, you've got messages from two different directions saying that they're going to come and try to enlist the Saints, and one source says they're going to be enemies if you don't. So there's all this concern and angst. So although the story that the Saints will be exterminated if they don't sign up seems to be incorrect, there certainly was opportunity to misunderstand and to misconstrue what was happening as a true threat to the leadership. And so you see there that night, Brigham Young is really in a real fit to get the arms and the cannons across the Missouri River and out of the United States territory. So we want to talk about this just a little bit more here at Redemption Hill. Does someone have a question? Someone's got their microphone. Someone's got their mic on. Please mute that if you would. So anyway, but here's the important point. Lieutenant Price had sent these two people up to see what was going on at Council Bluffs. Well, who were those two men? One was Second Lieutenant Abraham Lincoln, and the second person that went along with Lincoln was Dr. George B. Sanderson, and this is detailed in Willard Richards' journal. So here's Lieutenant Price's report back once Lincoln and Sanderson report. He says that because of this report of so many Mormons, I sent Lincoln up there to see what was going on and make himself acquainted as correctly as possible with their numbers and condition. He said they were encamped near the Potawatomi Agency. There were about 3,000. There's going to be more coming in every day, maybe up to 8,000. He says they're poor. They look in full poverty, but they're making every exertion consistent with their means to immigrate. But order and quiet pervades in their movements, and thus far, no act of theirs has given any occasion for adoption of any feelings. However, the citizens of the adjoining counties are really worried about the intentions of the immigrants. He also reports, Lincoln reports, that they express a desire to cultivate the most friendly relations with all that they meet on the route. Unfortunately, of course, Brigham Young and the church leaders are not aware of Lincoln's feelings in his report to Price. And that just goes on to ramp up the feelings of concern and paranoia, if you will. So that's on Sunday the 28th. On the 30th, Allen arrives, just a few hours behind the express rider who's come to tell them what's going on. And at the same time, Thomas Kane arrives just a few days later. So here is the only, let's try that again. Here's the only, if you will, photograph because there were no photographers in the area. This is the best representation we have of what the enlisting camp of the Mormons on the 14th of July, 1846 looked like. And this is sketched by Thomas Kane, and it actually has an explanation. You see a little log split rail fence here that's been thrown up. And in his explanation, you see some of these markings, CB, A. This, he explains, is Captain Allen's camp. Here's a line of wagons going down, headed out to the Missouri River Flats. There's the Missouri River with the trees and the line and the hills beyond. These are the hills. But right here, this is Mosquito Creek right there with a bunch of trees. And this flat hill right here is Redemption Hill. If you look really, really, really carefully right there, that's the flagpole, and there's the flag under which the Mormon Battalion enlisted. It wasn't just tacked up to the side of a tree with Brigham Young sitting at a table. It was a full-blown 50, 60, 80-foot tall flagpole with different flags flying there depending upon the situation. And this is the annotated version of that. I took it and I took the description and the explanation on the back. I took that and put it here on the front so that you can read that. But there's the flagpole right there. And Allen says, I went and I stayed at Thomas Kane says, I went and stayed at Captain Allen's camp to show that we were of the same mind. And I'm sure he was explaining some of the things they had discussion with President Polk about and the concerns. So you've got a presidential representative staying in the tent of the man who's trying to raise the Mormon Battalion and explaining what the presidential desires are. So when you see this extensive effort by the Army to bend over backwards to accommodate the Mormons and to try to enlist them and try to keep them happy and let the families go along and all of these things, that's because there is a clear understanding that the executive of the United States wants the Mormons to be pacified. He wants them to be conciliated. He wants them to be taken care of. And that's pretty typical in the military. You follow the orders of the civilians, even if they don't make sense in a military indication. I'm not going to go into a lot of the other things. That's a lot of the background, but here's what happens. So Allen arrives on June 30th in the late afternoon, asks for a meeting with Brigham Young and the leadership, and so they meet the next morning here at the enlisting camp of the Mormons. And again, in further detail, there's Taylor Pratt Hill, here's the flagpole, and the wagons there at Mosquito Creek. So that's on July 1st that Allen meets with Brigham Young and the leadership. We know that Brigham Young expressed his concerns over where will we stay, and Allen says he'll do his best to make sure that happens. It's contingent upon raising a battalion of Mormons. So there were conditions. They do negotiations with the Indians. Now, sometimes you hear that Allen went with Brigham Young back to Mount Pisgah to try to raise troops. That is not true. Allen stays at the bluffs while Brigham Young, Heber C. Kimball, Orson Pratt, and others head back east to try to raise the Mormon Battalion, try to raise the troops that will become the Mormon Battalion. And so they're gone from the morning of July 2nd. They return the evening of July 12th, coming back from Mount Pisgah, where they raised about 60, 65, 66 men. We've not found any list from Garden Grove, but we do know of at least one man who Howard Brunker is the last name. Anyway, he enlists from Garden Grove. There may have been others, but we haven't found a list from Garden Grove yet. They come back, and on Brigham Young's return on the evening of the 12th, he says, okay, we want to have a meeting. So they put the flag up, the flagpole again, which tells everybody come to the rendezvous location. Everybody comes. Alan, Brigham Young, and others make the presentation. That afternoon, the 13th, they hold the first of a number of recruitment balls, if you will. They have music and everything. It's a little unclear whether this is the one where they sing the song about we wept when we remembered Zion. Originally, I thought that was done this day on the 13th. I'm beginning to believe that was actually done on the 18th, as had been believed previously. The Bowery is right here. We have CCA Christiansen's painting of that. Of course, he wasn't there, but I think this is pretty good representation of what it looked like. So they hold the meetings and they begin recruiting those troops there on the 13th. Now, Kane says that within a couple of days they had the troops they needed. This gets a little bit. We've spent a lot of time looking at this, and Christine Forbes, Marianne Kirk, and Laura and I and others have spent many months now trying to untangle this timeline. I hope to have a timeline for you this evening, a simplified one. That did not happen this week, and I apologize, but we will be posting a more extensive timeline on the website before very long, as soon as we can make sure we've got all the details that we want on there correctly. With that timeline, we know that literally within 48 hours, they had enough men to form at least the minimum required number of men to form 4 of the companies. Now, they probably didn't have a total of 400, but they had at least the minimum number of men they needed to form those 4 companies. And then the rest of the time, so the 13th, they began, the 14th and the 15th, they had enough men. And on the morning of the 16th, they meet, they form the square with the 4 companies that they had enough men for. And Allen accepts them into the service. There are some interesting things that we're continuing to pursue on the process of how that happened. But Allen accepts them, and from that date, their service begins as of July 16 of 1846 for 1 year. They march off to Sarpies, about 5 miles away. They had been up, if they weren't with their families all spread out through the Grand Encampment area, then you have to look at this enlisting camp sketch that Kane did and say, well, they were collecting the men in this general area, the ones that didn't have families or the ones where their families were further away. They're collecting the men for the battalion in this particular area. But once they enlist on the 16th, then they move down to Peter Sarpy's trading post in this area, and they camp just a little bit east of that, very close to the river. So that's where the majority of the group is at, the soldiers' camp. And I propose that we do make a differentiation between the enlisting camp up here at the Bluffs with the soldiers' camp down here, because a number of them refer to it as the soldiers' camp in their journals. Now, this is the location down here on the 18th where they hold the farewell ball, and probably this is where the song that we wept when we remembered Zion, and the fair young lady mezzo-soprano who sings it is so well described by Thomas Kane. I think this is where it occurs finally. Now that's on the 18th of Saturday. The 19th, most of the men are given a furlough and they head back to visit their families at the Bluffs. I would say probably the majority of men do. So they're on furlough. Also on the 19th, on that Sunday, there's some heavy duty preaching to find the remaining men that they need to fill out the 5th company and make the 500 men. They get another 40 or 50 men, that makes up the last number that they need. There's little horse trading going on between people moving from one company to another, which further complicates the story. But those men then leave their family on the morning of the 20th, and they start making their way down to Sarpes. So when you see stories that the Mormon battalion started their journey on the 20th, I think that's a misconception. I think that's primarily because of these men who are coming back from their families, or the final 40 or 50 men that are going to join and come down to the soldiers' camp. The next day, the 21st, a Tuesday, it rains in the morning. Willard Richards comments on this in his journal. And if you read the journals of the men who were down there at Sarpes, they say, we didn't leave. We had intended to leave this morning, but we did not leave until the afternoon because it rained so heavily this morning. So I think the real start for Fort Leavenworth was on the morning of was on the afternoon of the 21st, after the rainstorm ceased. So that brings us up to after they've enlisted. Of course, they get their some of their gear there at Sarpes, and they're organizing themselves. If you've ever been part of a moving camp, you realize that it just takes days to get everybody on the same page and make sure you've got all the things they need. And that was the 4 or 5 days that they're hanging around at Sarpes trying to get themselves organized to head on out for Fort Leavenworth. That's my time, and I'm going to call it quits there. We've got them enlisted and on their way to Fort Leavenworth, and I hope that we have an opportunity to share more of these very interesting discoveries that we've made. But we now know that Sanderson had direct contact with the leadership of the church long before the Mormon Battalion was being raised, at least 2 weeks.